I never asked for praise, just stability. That was the deal. My name is Landon Price. I'm 41 years old, and I was the senior network and security architect at L-Iron Solutions for nearly 9 years. When I started, the company was a tech startup running out of a second-hand office space with old switches and paper sign-in sheets. The CEO had no clue how firewalls worked, and the CTO couldn't explain the difference between a proxy and a VPN. But they had ambition, and I had patience. So I built everything. From the ground up, I designed their internal security systems, multi-layered access controls, encrypted backups, and an automated flagging tool that tracked anomalies across all user activity. Nobody asked for it, but they sure needed it. In the early years, I worked late into the night. I'd crawl through config files, rewrite scripts, and map out privilege escalation scenarios most companies wouldn't even consider. When the team grew, I trained the junior devs myself, made documentation, ran drills, simulated breach responses. They called me paranoid. But when our competitors got hit with ransomware in 2020 and we didn't, suddenly my paranoia looked like foresight. Every major contract passed through infrastructure I touched, every payroll record, client email, and proprietary build. I knew every dependency, every vulnerability, every blind spot, and not once did I fail them. There were problems, of course. The CTO changed twice. The CEO brought in new investors. Startups do that. But my system stayed. It outlasted flashy dashboards and rebrands. It kept working because I never stopped improving it. By year 5, my code was the backbone of their network. No one said it out loud, but if you pulled me out, the whole thing would fall. Or so I thought. The first sign came in a company-wide meeting. The CEO, fresh off a podcast appearance and clearly feeling proud of himself, made a comment about moving toward more scalable cloud-based infrastructure. No one looked at me when he said it. I just finished migrating our last legacy server 2 months prior. We were already scalable. We were already cloud-based. This wasn't about technology. This was about control. I should have paid more attention to who was in the room. The new face, a guy named Drew with slick hair and a louder laugh than IQ, had been brought in as a digital modernization consultant, which in corporate speak meant, we're about to fire someone who actually knows what they're doing. Drew didn't ask questions, he made suggestions, like how our monitoring tool was too granular or how users shouldn't need to authenticate twice for admin-level changes. When I pushed back, gently, he smiled and said, "Old systems make people feel safe, but they don't move us forward." I didn't argue, I just made notes. A week later, I found out he'd been given access to the admin panel. No one told me. I caught it in the logs, which meant either they forgot I still monitored everything, or they thought I wouldn't notice. Either way, I stayed quiet, but I made one final change to the system. Something small, something buried, and then I waited. The day I lost my job started out like any other. It was a Thursday morning, unusually sunny for October. The air was crisp and I arrived early, coffee in hand, settling into my routine of reviewing overnight security logs. Nothing looked out of place at first. The company was running smoothly. Transactions processed, servers humming, and our security layers held firm as usual. The comfort of routine masked the storm quietly brewing in the executive offices down the hall. Around 10 a.m., an email appeared from HR. "Brief catch-up meeting," the subject line read. It struck me as odd. HR rarely spoke with me directly. I clicked open my calendar to see the invite already sitting there, scheduled for 10:30 a.m. in a conference room at the opposite end of the building. My gut told me something was wrong, but my mind rationalized it. Perhaps a quick check-in, maybe something routine about payroll adjustments. Still, the anxiety lingered. At precisely 10:29, I stepped into the small conference room. HR's representative, Elaine, sat at the far end smiling gently in the practiced way HR people do when they deliver bad news. Beside her was Drew, the so-called digital modernization consultant, who hadn't stopped questioning every security protocol since his arrival. Drew wore a subtle smirk, almost hidden beneath his carefully trimmed beard. A chill went down my spine, but I kept my face neutral. Elaine gestured to a seat. "Landon, we appreciate you making time," she began, her voice soft but firm. "You've contributed significantly to L-Iron Solutions' growth and stability over the years." My chest tightened. I knew corporate doublespeak well enough to brace for the blow. She paused, took a short breath, then continued. However, as you know, our company's needs evolve rapidly, and we've decided to move in a new direction regarding our digital security architecture. Drew interjected smoothly, leaning forward, fingers steepled in front of him. We're implementing a more streamlined cloud-based solution that requires fewer manual interventions, he explained, his tone dripping with a forced earnestness. We believe it aligns better with our current strategic vision and offers the flexibility our growing enterprise needs. I kept my voice calm, deliberately steady. So, you're letting me go? Elaine nodded slowly, eyes avoiding mine for a fraction of a second. Yes, your position has been made redundant, effective immediately. We'll provide you with 2 weeks' pay in lieu of notice and a month of severance. Drew leaned back, seemingly satisfied the unpleasant part of this meeting was complete. Is there anything you'd like to ask? Elaine offered softly, almost compassionately. I had questions, but none that they'd answer honestly. What about the projects I'd led for almost a decade? Did Drew truly understand the complex security architecture I'd built? Was my meticulous documentation even read before this decision? But I knew their minds were made up, so I simply shook my head. Number that I understand, I said quietly. Elaine handed me a folder containing my termination paperwork. Drew rose and extended his hand. Best of luck, Landon, he said cheerfully. I met his gaze briefly, seeing nothing but empty confidence staring back. I hope you find something suitable soon. I took the folder, left his hand hanging in the air, and walked out without another word. Back at my desk, the office felt foreign. My heart pounded softly in my chest. 9 years reduced to a neat folder and a polite dismissal. I sat in quiet disbelief, letting the numbness fade into a slow, simmering anger. Around me, coworkers continued their day, oblivious. But across the room, through the glass walls of a meeting space, Drew stood chatting with the CEO, both of them smiling, oblivious or unconcerned about the impact of their decision. I knew in that moment I'd become just another name scratched from their payroll, my years of effort swept aside for a shinier pitch and a flashier presentation. Slowly, methodically, I began packing my things, personal items, notebooks filled with documentation, a plant gifted by a coworker years before. As I gathered my belongings, the reality hit me. I'd built the system from the ground up, and now they planned to run it without the architect, who knew every flaw and hidden switch. The realization was bitter, but also strangely calming. I didn't rush. I carefully removed my personal backups from the desk drawers, including several old external drives containing critical documentation I'd made years ago, just in case. After a decade, paranoia was a professional reflex. Then I took one final glance around the workspace that had been mine, stood and walked slowly toward the exit, nodding silently to colleagues whose puzzled looks followed my exit. Nobody stopped me. Nobody asked where I was going. At home, the quiet emptiness of my apartment echoed with a sense of unfamiliar freedom and uncertainty. I sat on my couch looking blankly at the black TV screen, running the day's events over again in my mind. My phone buzzed occasionally with messages from confused coworkers, curious or sympathetic, but I ignored them for now. I needed space and silence to think. After a few hours, clarity emerged. I powered up my home workstation and opened the admin panel out of habit. I half expected my credentials to be revoked already, but surprisingly, they hadn't disabled my primary account, an oversight. Or perhaps they thought Drew already had everything under control. Either way, their oversight would be their mistake. I browsed through system logs, habit again, but noticed immediately that no one had applied the latest security patch I'd scheduled for deployment earlier that week. It was still pending, awaiting approval from Drew, who obviously either hadn't seen it or hadn't understood its importance. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen. They had no idea what they'd just done. Without this patch, their shiny new cloud architecture was exposed. I wasn't planning sabotage. I wasn't petty. But it wasn't my responsibility anymore to save them from themselves. If Drew had wanted full control, he now had it, and with it, the responsibility for every oversight, every vulnerability, every looming failure. I took a deep breath and closed the console. For the first time since that fateful meeting, I felt a strange sort of peace. I wasn't powerless after all. I still held one card they hadn't considered: my silence. Their system wasn't as robust as they thought. It never was without me. Now they'd learn exactly what that meant. and I wouldn't have to lift a finger to teach them. In the days following my abrupt termination, I found myself adjusting to a strange new routine. No early morning alarms, no quick commutes, no familiar hum of server rooms or blinking dashboards. Instead, mornings brought silence, a disorienting quiet that underscored how quickly I'd gone from integral to obsolete. Yet, despite this unsettling shift, my focus quickly returned to the systems I'd left behind. The habit of monitoring the security infrastructure I'd built was too ingrained to simply abandon overnight. Each day I logged into the administrative portal using the credentials they had inexplicably neglected to deactivate. Maybe it was oversight. Maybe they underestimated my commitment. Either way, their neglect provided me continued visibility, one they clearly never anticipated. From the quiet of my home office, I could still see deep into Eliron's operations, watching as Drew clumsily navigated a landscape he only partially understood. It was like watching someone wander blindfolded through a minefield, uncomfortable, yet impossible to ignore. At first, things appeared stable enough. Drew pushed through minor changes, superficial adjustments to user permissions, and redundant toggling of firewall settings. He undoubtedly believed these minor tweaks symbolized meaningful modernization. I watched him rename security groups, label changes as optimized, and adjust settings to impress his superiors, who themselves barely grasped the technical nuances. It was painful yet fascinating, like watching someone repaint a wall to hide cracks in the foundation. A week passed, and it seemed Drew was convinced of his own competence. But on day 8, I caught the first signs of trouble, a small alert, innocuous at first glance. A login attempt from an unfamiliar IP address at 2:47 a.m., marked as suspicious by the anomaly detection tool I'd coded myself. The system flagged it clearly, yet Drew dismissed it, marking it as a false positive. My jaw tightened as I read his note. System glitch. Ignore. This wasn't a glitch. This was precisely the kind of subtle intrusion attempt my protocols were designed to flag immediately. Drew's oversight wasn't just naive, it was reckless. That early intrusion attempt signaled someone probing our defenses, a first step in a larger, potentially devastating breach. Yet Drew had brushed it off, confident that he knew better. I felt anger simmering, not simply at Drew's arrogance, but at his blatant disregard for the careful structure I'd spent nearly a decade crafting. Over the next few days, the alerts multiplied quietly. Minor anomalies began cascading across the logs, failed attempts to access sensitive folders, small but repeated authentication errors, and brief spikes in outbound data traffic late at night. To the untrained eye, these were negligible. Isolated glitches easily rationalized away. To mine, they told a clear, alarming story. Someone was testing the perimeter, methodically probing for weakness. Eliron's defenses were under silent assault, and the new gatekeeper either couldn't see it or wouldn't admit it. One evening, as I scanned logs while half watching the news, a particularly glaring alert appeared. A sudden spike in traffic accessing confidential HR files. My heart quickened. Whoever was probing had gotten inside, at least partially. My fingers hovered instinctively over the keyboard, itching to intervene, to send an urgent message or lock down access myself. But I paused. I was no longer part of the team. They had made that crystal clear. Drew had wanted control. This was now his responsibility. Still, I documented everything meticulously, screenshotting each anomaly, noting timestamps, and saving records. Perhaps it was habit, or maybe a lingering sense of duty, but I wasn't ready to discard my professional integrity. I kept records of each intrusion attempt and Drew's dismissive reactions, building a detailed timeline that clearly illustrated both the growing threat and the negligence allowing it. By day 14, the breaches were becoming undeniable. A wave of user accounts had their passwords reset without authorization. Employees began sending panicked messages, locked out of their workstations, wondering aloud on company forums about possible hacks. Drew scrambled visibly, finally realizing the gravity of what he'd ignored. He began frantically resetting permissions, randomly locking out legitimate users in an attempt to stop the bleeding. Watching this chaos unfold from afar was surreal. I felt no satisfaction seeing the turmoil, but a certain grim vindication settled over me. This wasn't sabotage. This was inevitability. Systems aren't resilient because of software alone. They're resilient because the people managing them understand their complexities and vulnerabilities. Drew, in his arrogant rush to replace what I'd carefully built, had dismissed my experience. Now the entire company was paying the price. As the evening drew on, I closed my laptop and leaned back, exhaling slowly. The damage was done, and Alyron Solutions was finally waking up to the cost of underestimating what it had lost. Tomorrow, they would no doubt call emergency meetings, issue public apologies, and launch frantic investigations. But tonight I simply sat quietly, knowing I'd done my job, even if they hadn't let me finish it. And quietly, almost unnoticed beneath my frustration, I felt an odd sense of calm. They'd made their choice, and now they would learn from it. After years of warnings ignored and efforts overlooked, perhaps this was exactly the lesson they needed. I had always prided myself on crafting security systems with subtlety and precision. My approach wasn't flashy, it was quietly comprehensive. The layers I'd built weren't designed solely to withstand direct attacks. They were also intended to guard against internal incompetence. Each layer of security I developed had a hidden fail-safe tripwire. A built-in mechanism triggered when specific violations occurred repeatedly. I'd considered removing it when I left, but Drew's arrival had changed my mind. Now my carefully designed protocols were quietly doing exactly what they were supposed to, escalating warnings into automatic protective actions. I watched from my home computer as Drew stumbled through the system, oblivious to the internal alarms he was inadvertently setting off. Every time he incorrectly dismissed a security alert or forcefully reset a user account without following my prescribed procedures, he unknowingly brought the company one step closer to a complete system lockdown. What Drew mistook for minor inconveniences were actually red flags of a security infrastructure preparing to defend itself from perceived threats, even threats originating from within. At first, the effects were subtle. Automated restrictions kicked in, limiting certain high-level access privileges. Drew and his hastily assembled IT team began complaining on internal forums about unexpected permission denials. Confusion rippled through the office. Employees began to notice delays and irregularities, emails failing to send, shared drives inaccessible, remote logins inexplicably blocked. Each time Drew attempted to manually override these issues, the system tightened its grip further, assuming it was under internal attack. I followed every panicked forum post, every frustrated help desk ticket, feeling vindicated yet strangely distant from the chaos. Then came the tipping point. At exactly 2:12 p.m., on a rainy Thursday afternoon, almost poetic in its mundanity, the automated lockdown fully triggered. My final failsafe was a protective protocol that secured the company's most sensitive information by automatically revoking access to critical servers if certain security thresholds were repeatedly breached. Drew's careless attempts at modernizing the infrastructure had tripped that exact wire. Now, the system responded precisely as I had programmed it, swiftly, silently, and comprehensively, shutting itself off from perceived internal sabotage. Within moments, the entire office was thrown into chaos. Servers stopped responding, files disappeared behind security walls, and employees were left staring helplessly at screens displaying messages none of them understood. Drew scrambled visibly, flooding the internal messaging system with frantic, contradictory instructions. I watched silently from afar, noting his desperation. He no longer appeared confident. Instead, he was overwhelmed and outmatched by the depth of security he had arrogantly dismissed. At 4 p.m. sharp, my phone buzzed. The caller ID showed the number I'd been expecting, Alyron Solutions' main office. I stared at it for a moment, letting it ring several times before declining the call. A second later, it buzzed again, this time a direct call from Elaine in HR. Again, I let it ring until voicemail took over. Drew tried next, his number flashing insistently. His message was breathless, panicked. "Landon, something's happening. Your system locked us out. We need your help immediately. Please call back." I deleted it without responding. The office's panic became palpable in online forums and chat groups. Employees demanded answers, blaming IT, blaming Drew, blaming management, anyone who seemed responsible. I continued to quietly document everything, screenshots time-stamped carefully. I wasn't interfering. I was just an observer now, detached but thorough. The detailed logs I kept would serve as irrefutable proof of the incompetence that had led to this disaster. Around 6 p.m., the chaos reached its apex. Drew, unable to restore the system himself, desperately tried escalating issues directly to senior executives. The CEO sent out a hurried email assuring everyone they were working diligently to resolve minor technical issues. But employees weren't convinced. Frustrated and skeptical, they openly discussed seeking new jobs online, their trust in management shattered by confusion and incompetence. Watching this unfold, I felt neither triumph nor regret, just a cold realization that Drew had fundamentally misunderstood the system he'd claimed to master. It wasn't merely lines of code or flashy dashboards. It was a delicate ecosystem built on meticulous checks, balances, and protective redundancies that required careful stewardship, not reckless bravado. He had treated it as an inconvenience rather than as the powerful but fragile network it truly was. Late into the evening, an email notification finally appeared that caught my attention. It came from the board of directors, addressed directly to me. The subject line read simply, "Urgent request for consultation." I opened it slowly, savoring the words. They asked politely but urgently for assistance in resolving what they described as a critical infrastructure failure. I almost smiled at their understated language. I leaned back in my chair, the screen's glow illuminating my face in the dim room. It seemed Eliron had finally realized the flaw they hadn't seen. It wasn't the system itself, nor the complexity of the infrastructure. It was their arrogance, assuming they no longer needed the very person who understood how to keep it safe. They needed me now more than ever. And I fully intended to remind them precisely why. I sat quietly, staring at the board's email glowing softly on my screen. After nearly 2 decades building and securing digital fortresses, I knew exactly how this game played out. They weren't reaching out because they valued my expertise. They were desperate. Their new wonder boy, Drew, had failed spectacularly. The system I'd meticulously built wasn't compromised by an external threat. It was compromised by arrogance and negligence from within. Still, I didn't respond immediately. I took my time, letting the hours pass, allowing panic to set deeper roots in their hallways. My inbox buzzed again around 9 p.m., this time from Drew himself. His words were uncharacteristically humble, almost pleading. "Landon," he wrote, "I underestimated the complexity of your setup. I can't fix this alone. Can you please help?" I reread the message slowly, noting the complete reversal of his tone. Only days ago he had confidently dismissed every protocol I'd ever established. Now he openly admitted defeat. The irony wasn't lost on me, but sympathy wasn't part of this equation. Trust had been shattered, not just mine, but the trust of every employee relying on a secure working environment. I opened the admin panel again, checking the current status. The system lockdown was absolute. Critical servers were inaccessible, client communications halted, and productivity ground to a standstill. I knew the board's panic had likely turned to outright dread. Their reputation was at stake, and without quick resolution, the fallout would be disastrous. I finally drafted a careful, concise reply to the board's message. Please clarify the exact nature of your request and specify the permissions I currently retain. It was intentionally vague, formal enough to remind them I owed them nothing, yet open enough to leave room for negotiation. Their response came swiftly, almost instantly. Full permissions restored. Immediate consultation requested to regain operational control. Their urgency was palpable. Reluctantly, I logged back into my former account with restored privileges and began carefully reviewing the logs. Drew's attempts to override the lockdown had only compounded the issue, layering mistake upon mistake. The network logs revealed the depth of his incompetence. He had mistakenly triggered every defensive mechanism I'd coded, thinking they were minor bugs to be bypassed. Now the entire system viewed him and most senior users as active threats. I compiled an itemized report highlighting each error Drew made and detailing precisely how each action had triggered deeper lockdowns. Each line was coldly factual, stripped of emotion or blame, yet devastating in its clarity. This was not sabotage. This was accountability. A meticulous record of every reckless decision Drew had made, every ignored protocol, every dismissed warning. I sent the detailed audit back to the board, along with a brief, direct message. Your system functioned exactly as designed. Each escalation was automatically triggered by user negligence. Resolution requires immediate revision of all recent permissions granted without due diligence. It was a clinical response. No gloating, no anger, only raw data. But the implications were unmistakable. This crisis was their own doing. Within minutes, my phone buzzed again. This time a direct call from the CEO himself. I let it ring, deliberately waiting before answering. His voice was strained, barely controlled. "Landon, we need you here. Can you come in tonight?" There was no trace of his usual arrogance, just raw anxiety and exhaustion. "Please," he added quietly. "The situation is critical." I paused, considering carefully. This was the moment I had anticipated since my unceremonious dismissal. Yet even now I felt no triumph. This was about integrity, not revenge. After a long moment I finally spoke. "I'll come in," I said quietly, "but only under very specific conditions. First, a formal acknowledgement in writing of my contributions and an apology from management. Second, I require a clear written agreement outlining my consulting role, responsibilities, and fair compensation. And finally, Drew's complete removal from the security oversight team." There was silence at the other end. For a moment I thought the CEO might refuse outright, but desperation is a powerful motivator. After a long pause, he sighed deeply, finally conceding. "Done. Anything else?" "No," I said calmly. "That'll suffice." An hour later, a company courier delivered the signed agreement to my door. Everything I'd asked for was there, detailed clearly and precisely. The apology letter written personally by the CEO was particularly satisfying, not for the flattery, but for the genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and oversight. I carefully filed it away, knowing it represented more than a personal victory. It was a safeguard against future misunderstandings. As midnight approached, I logged into the company's secure network remotely, applying immediate corrective measures. The task was challenging, yet familiar and methodical. Piece by piece, I lifted the lockdowns, reset permissions, and brought the system back online. It took hours, meticulous labor spent correcting mistakes I had warned against repeatedly. Yet, in the quiet of the early morning, I felt no resentment, only calm satisfaction knowing the truth had finally been understood. At dawn, Eliron Solutions Network was operational once again, fully secured and stable. I knew the board would announce publicly that normal operations had resumed, crediting it to rapid intervention by our dedicated security team. My name might not appear publicly, but internally there would be no doubt about who had truly restored order. I closed my laptop and leaned back, watching the sun slowly rise through my window. I understood something clearly now that perhaps even they didn't. True control of the system had never been about usernames or admin permissions. It had always been about understanding, competence, and integrity, qualities no flashy consultant or careless executive could ever replicate. In the days following the crisis, Eliron Solutions quietly stabilized, eager to bury their public embarrassment. Drew vanished from internal emails, replaced by temporary consultants who handled minor adjustments. I fulfilled my consulting role meticulously, but only as long as necessary. Soon my tasks were done and the system hummed steadily again. The morning of my final departure, the CEO appeared at my temporary workspace. His demeanor was humbled, far removed from his usual arrogance. "Landon," he began hesitantly, "thank you for everything." I gave him a measured nod, gathering my things slowly. "Just remember, security isn't a line item you can outsource," I replied. "It requires respect for those who build it." He offered a silent nod, clearly understanding my message. I left without fanfare, walking through familiar corridors one last time. As the glass doors closed behind me, I felt a calm satisfaction. I'd left them secure and operational, but more importantly, I'd left them wiser. A few weeks later, emails arrived from competitors offering generous contracts. Word had quietly spread about my work at Eliron, and my inbox was flooded with requests. But I didn't rush. I carefully considered my next step, knowing now that true value was not in the position itself, but in the integrity and respect earned. They had forgotten one tiny detail, that systems reflect the people who build them. They'd learned that the hard way, and I had ensured I'd never need to teach them again.